For decades, Rolf Harris was seen as a beloved entertainer, a familiar face trusted by millions. But behind that image, there were questions that never fully went away, even after his conviction and prison sentence. The person who stood closest to him, his daughter, Bindi Nichols, lived through both the admiration and the collapse of that reputation. Now, after his death, her story carries a different weight, shaped by what she witnessed, what she felt, and what she lost. What she reveals is not just about her father, but about the cost of truth inside a family. The daughter who grew up in his shadow. Bindi Nichols did not grow up in an ordinary household, even though much of her childhood appeared quiet on the surface. As the only child of Rolf Harris and his wife Alwyn Hughes, she spent her early years in a home that was creative, artistic, and often isolated from the outside world. She described her upbringing as lonely at times, shaped by the fact that she had no siblings and lived in the shadow of a father who was constantly admired by others but emotionally distant at home. While the public saw a charismatic entertainer, she experienced a man who could be withdrawn, quiet, and largely disengaged from family life. She told the court that her father was someone who seemed to give his energy to the outside world, where he could entertain, joke, and connect with new people. But once he returned home, he often switched off. That contrast became a defining part of her childhood. She and her mother built a life centered around creativity, reading, writing songs, and spending time together, while her father remained somewhat detached from daily family interactions. It created an environment where emotional closeness was not always present, even if stability appeared to exist from the outside. One of the most important relationships in Bindi's early life was her friendship with a girl who would later become central to the allegations against her father. She described this friend as her absolute bestest friend in the world, someone she was inseparable from. They spent nearly all their time together, sharing experiences, conversations, and a level of closeness that only childhood friendships can reach. According to Bindi, they were stuck together like glue, rarely wanting to be apart, even for small moments. This friendship extended into family life, including holidays and shared experiences that seemed ordinary at the time. One of those trips, a family holiday, would later be revisited in court under completely different circumstances. At the time, however, Bindi recalled nothing unusual. She insisted that she never saw any signs of distress from her friend, no visible changes in behavior, no signs of fear or anxiety. To her, everything appeared normal, which would later make the allegations even harder for her to process. As she grew older, Bindi continued to see her father through the lens of both a public figure and a private parent. There was a gap between those two identities that she may not have fully understood at the time, but it existed nonetheless. The man who entertained millions was not always the same man at home, and that difference would become more significant as the years went on. The phone call that shattered everything. The turning point in Bindi Nichols' life did not happen in public, and it did not unfold slowly over time. It came suddenly, through a phone call that forced her to confront something she had never imagined possible. By the time the allegations reached her, they were no longer distant rumors. They were personal, direct, and impossible to ignore, because they involved someone she had trusted completely, her closest childhood friend. When Bindi first learned that her friend had accused her father of sexual abuse, her reaction was immediate and overwhelming. According to court testimony, she contacted Rolf Harris directly to confront him. This was not a quiet or controlled conversation. It was charged with shock, anger, and confusion, as she demanded answers from the man she had known her entire life. For Bindi, the situation was not just about accusations in the media or legal proceedings. It was about reconciling two versions of reality that could not exist at the same time. The emotional impact of that moment was severe. Evidence presented in court described how Bindi was beside herself, struggling to process what she had just learned. Her reaction went far beyond disbelief. She reportedly smashed paintings that her father had given her, destroying objects that once symbolized their relationship. The act was not random. It reflected a deeper emotional rupture, as if she was physically rejecting the connection she had once had with him. Her distress did not stop there. It was also revealed that she had banged her head against a wall, an act that demonstrated the intensity of her emotional breakdown. This was not a symbolic reaction or a moment of frustration. It was a raw, physical expression of psychological shock, suggesting that she was unable to cope with the weight of what she had just discovered. At one point, it was acknowledged that she sought counseling, indicating that the situation had left a lasting impact on her mental state. What made the situation even more devastating was the nature of the allegation itself. Her friend claimed that the abuse had begun when she was just 13 years old, long before Bindi could have understood or recognized any warning signs. For Bindi, this meant that the friendship she had cherished might have existed alongside something deeply hidden. The idea that her father could have been involved in such actions during a time when she was present in the same environment created a sense of betrayal that was both personal and overwhelming. Rolf Harris, when questioned in court, admitted that he had been confronted by his daughter, but claimed he did not fully recall the details of her reaction. He acknowledged that she had been extremely upset, but he maintained his position that any relationship with the complainant had only begun when she was 18. He denied the allegations of abuse during her childhood, insisting that the accusations were not true. Inside the courtroom, two truths collide. When the case against Rolf Harris finally reached court, the situation moved beyond private confrontation and into a public examination of everything that had been hidden for decades. The trial was not centered on a single allegation, but on multiple accusations spanning many years, involving several young girls. For Bindi Nichols, this meant that what she had first experienced as a personal shock was now being dissected in detail in front of a jury, lawyers, and the wider public. During the proceedings, prosecutors sought to highlight a consistent pattern in the allegations. They argued that the accounts shared by different individuals were not isolated, but showed notable similarities. According to their case, Rolf Harris would often approach young individuals in his role as a well-known entertainer, beginning with what seemed like friendly or harmless interactions. The prosecution claimed that, in some instances, these interactions later crossed personal boundaries, often in situations where those involved felt unable to respond or remove themselves easily. In several accounts, it was suggested that other people were nearby at the time, yet the behavior went unnoticed, and afterward Harris continued as if nothing unusual had occurred. This proposed pattern became a key focus of the trial. Prosecutors emphasized that the similarities between the testimonies added weight to their argument, suggesting it would be unlikely for multiple individuals to independently describe such closely aligned experiences without a common basis. They also noted that some of the alleged incidents were described as brief and unexpected, leaving little time for those involved to react in the moment. Harris, however, firmly rejected this interpretation. Throughout the trial, he maintained that the accusations were false and insisted that the events described were either fabricated or physically impossible. He argued that the logistics of some of the alleged assaults did not make sense, stating that certain actions could not have taken place in the circumstances described. In his view, the similarities in the accounts did not indicate a pattern of behavior, but rather a coincidence or a shared narrative that had been constructed after the fact. The courtroom became a place where two completely opposing versions of reality were presented side by side. On one side were the testimonies of the complainants, supported by the prosecution's argument that their stories followed a consistent pattern. On the other side was Harris's defense, which framed the allegations as untrue and challenged both their plausibility and their accuracy. Bindi's role in this environment was deeply complex. She was not simply observing the trial from a distance. She was directly connected to one of the central allegations, as the complainant had been her closest friend. Her earlier testimony about their relationship was brought into context, highlighting how close they had been and how often they had been together during the years in question. This connection made the allegations even more difficult to process, as it suggested that if the claims were true, the events had taken place within a space she once considered safe and familiar. At the same time, Bindi had also provided statements that appeared to challenge aspects of the allegations. She said she had never witnessed any inappropriate behavior and had not noticed any signs of distress in her friend during the time they spent together. This created an additional layer of tension within the trial, as her perspective did not fully align with the claims being made by the complainant. The verdict, and the complete collapse of a life. When the jury finally reached its decision, the outcome left no ambiguity. Rolf Harris was found guilty on all 12 counts of indecent assault. The verdict did not reflect a single mistake or a misunderstanding. It confirmed, in the eyes of the court, a pattern of behavior that had taken place over many years and involved multiple victims. For Bindi Nichols, this was the moment when everything became irreversible. Whatever uncertainty or internal conflict she had held on to before was now replaced by a legal conclusion that could not be undone. The sentencing followed shortly after. Harris was given a total prison sentence of 5 years and 9 months. The judge made it clear that the seriousness of the offenses required a custodial sentence, and he addressed Harris directly, stating that he had shown no remorse for his actions. The words used in court were direct and uncompromising, emphasizing that the consequences he faced were the result of his own behavior. It was a stark contrast to the public image Harris had built over decades, and it marked the definitive end of that identity. He was taken into custody and initially held at a prison facility, before later being transferred to another institution designated for offenders of similar crimes. Although he would ultimately serve around 3 years before being released, the damage to his reputation was immediate and permanent. This was not a temporary fall from grace. It was a complete collapse. In the months following the conviction, institutions began to distance themselves from Harris. Honors and awards that had once recognized his contributions were withdrawn. Titles that had taken years to achieve were removed in a matter of weeks. He was stripped of distinctions such as the MBE, OBE, and CBE, as well as Australian honors and other recognitions. Organizations that had once celebrated him now publicly severed their association, reflecting the broader shift in how he was viewed. His removal from the Area Hall of Fame and the annulment of his BAFTA fellowship further demonstrated how far his standing had fallen. These were not symbolic gestures. They represented a deliberate effort to erase his presence from the institutions that had once elevated him. Even honorary degrees and cultural acknowledgments were revoked, leaving behind very little of the legacy he had spent decades building. At the same time, new allegations continued to surface. Additional charges were brought forward in later proceedings, covering incidents that allegedly occurred over an extended period and involved multiple individuals. While some of these cases resulted in acquittals or were not pursued further, they reinforced the sense that the original trial had only exposed part of a larger pattern. Harris attempted to challenge his conviction through the legal system, applying for permission to appeal. However, his efforts were unsuccessful. The courts refused to overturn the verdict, and only one specific conviction was later deemed unsafe and quashed. The remaining convictions stood, maintaining the overall judgment against him. During his time in prison, reports emerged that further complicated public perception. A letter attributed to Harris was published, containing language that was described as hostile toward his accusers. This led to renewed criticism, with legal representatives for the victims arguing that he had failed to understand the impact of his actions. Rather than showing remorse, the tone of the letter suggested continued denial and resentment. After his death, a name she could no longer keep. When Rolf Harris died at the age of 93, the announcement did not come immediately. His death was confirmed days later through official records, with his family asking for privacy and making no further public statements. The cause was listed as neck cancer combined with the frailty of old age, marking the final chapter of a life that had already been overshadowed by scandal for years. There was no public tribute that resembled the celebrations he once received. Instead, his passing was quiet, restrained, and largely defined by the legacy of his conviction rather than his decades of fame. By that point, the distance between his past success and his final years had become impossible to ignore. He had spent his last period of life dealing with serious illness, including a condition that left him mostly unable to speak and dependent on full-time care. The once highly visible entertainer had become almost entirely absent from public life, and when news of his death eventually surfaced, it carried none of the admiration that had once surrounded his name. For his daughter, however, the impact did not end with his death. If anything, it marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. Bindi Nichols had already lived through the collapse of her father's reputation, the trial, the conviction, and the emotional consequences that followed. But now she faced something more permanent, the reality of carrying a name that had become synonymous with scandal. At some point after his death, she made a decision that reflected just how deeply that association had affected her life. She stopped using the name Bindi Harris and began going by Ava Reeves. This was not a casual change or a temporary adjustment. It was a deliberate attempt to separate herself from a legacy that had become impossible to escape. According to those close to her, the decision was driven in part by the stigma attached to her father's name, particularly within the art world she was trying to build a career in. The reasoning behind the change was practical as well as personal. The Harris name, once widely recognized and respected, had become a barrier. It was suggested that artwork associated with that name was difficult to sell, not because of a lack of talent, but because of the weight of what it represented. By adopting a new identity, she was trying to give herself a chance to be judged on her own work rather than on her father's past. Despite these challenges, there were signs that her efforts were beginning to take hold. Some galleries started to accept her work, indicating that her new identity was allowing her to move forward in a way that had previously been difficult. This progress did not erase the past, but it suggested that she was finding a way to build something separate from it. Financially, it was believed that she was in a stable position following her father's death, with reports suggesting she had inherited significant wealth. However, that stability did not come without complications. Any financial connection to her father was inevitably tied to the same legacy she was trying to distance herself from. It created a situation where even the resources she had were linked to a past she could not fully leave behind. What do you think? Can someone truly escape a legacy like this, or does it always follow them no matter what they do? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more real stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.